I often say that you can tell when I'm a law professor because I have opinions without data. You can tell when I'm a political scientist because I have data without opinions. And you can tell when I'm being a lawyer because, well, it depends what my client tells me to say. So you can decide which role I'm playing at different points in this talk. But if you come to my class, you attend my class here at Stanford on the First Amendment, one of the first concepts you learn about is the marketplace of ideas, right? It's that age-old concept, starting maybe with John Stuart Mill, extending through an opinion by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in a Supreme Court opinion. And the idea, of course, is that if we just have more speech, right, in a competitive open marketplace, the more likely that the truth is going to win out, right? It's a core concept in thinking about American constitutional law and the First Amendment. Now, it's not clear that that was ever true, but it's certainly not true in the information and technological age that we live in now, right? It's not the case that the more speech that we see out there, the more likely that the truth is going to win out, and we see this not just in the United States, but around the world. But the question that I want to sort of pose to you and try to begin to answer here is, what is it about the technological affordances of the internet, the new digital communication ecosystem, that poses a unique stress on democracy? All right? And so the question is not, well, how do we combat fake news, or how do we combat hate speech? Fake news is as old as news. Hate speech is as old as speech. The question is, what is it about the technology itself that poses a stress on democracy? And so there are several sort of families of concerns that pose a stress to democracy when it comes to the digital age. The first is how the new communication ecosystem privileges velocity, virality, and volume. That is, the speed at which we talk and receive information, the fact that it's through viral peer-to-peer transfer, and the sheer amount of information that we have on our cell phones in our pockets, right? So the first point on the velocity of information in the technological age we live in. So you may have heard of this quote, right? A lie makes its way halfway around the world before the truth puts its boots on. Have you heard that idea? If you look on the internet right now, you'll see it's attributed to Mark Twain in 1917. Turns out Mark Twain was dead in 1917, so it's a little bit sort of fake news about fake news. But the point still holds, right? Which is that a lie becomes increasingly difficult to combat in this new technological ecosystem regarding information that we live in, because once it's out there and once it's made its way around the world on the different platforms, it's incredibly difficult to combat. Now, that is democracy relevant, right? Because elections occur at a particular point in time, right? And so a well-placed lie in the run-up to an election is becoming increasingly difficult to combat. That's because the communication infrastructure, right, privileges virality as opposed to having referees that determine what kind of information flows to consumers. Now, that is a great beauty and in some ways democratic character of the internet, that we've removed the legacy media intermediaries, right, who had become referees as to what kind of information you could receive, right? The internet gives everyone a megaphone to talk to the world. But what a political system that is based on virality privileges is appeals to emotion and outrage, right? We as political scientists know that the kinds of communications, strategies, and candidacies that succeed in an environment of virality, right, where virality is privileged, are those that appeal to emotion. Now, like I said, it's mostly outrage. Outrage is something that we can, really sort of be triggered by on the internet. To some extent, it's feelings of love. That's why you have cat videos in your news feed, right? But the question then is, well, again, thinking about the democracy endangering threats to the internet, what is it about virality and the kind of communications and candidacies and strategies that then are privileged under that system? And finally, as I said, volume. We simply have so much information that we have at our fingertips. And because, like I said, we carry it around in our pockets on our cell phones, this requires some kind of curation, some kind of organization by some kind of authority. And so the decisions that are made by the platforms become increasingly important. Second sort of not unique feature of the internet, but something that's accelerated by the internet, is the power that anonymous speakers have in the information environment. Now, if you take my First Amendment class, well, you learn that anonymity is actually constitutionally protected. Right here in the United States, you have a First Amendment right to speak anonymously, right? And around the world, people have taken advantage of the anonymity that is afforded by the internet, whether it's protesters in the Arab Spring, right, or people tweeting in Turkey, or people who don't want to reveal their identity because they would like to, they fear government repression. But it's the anonymity feature of the internet which gives us the bot problem and the unaccountable hate speech problem. So first, the bot problem. If you had to identify, again, something about the technology that is itself inherently threatening to democracy, the fact that we are going to be unable, and really are even now, unable to tell who is speaking to us, a computer or a person, really highlights the unique stress that the internet is posing to democracy, right? Now, there's a lot of debate over how big a deal bots are in terms of their persuasive impact on voters and the like. We know that roughly 10% of Twitter is bots. Most communication, the majority of communication that happens on the internet right now is done by computers, not by human beings, right? Roughly 40% of the accounts on Twitter in Russia are bots. Most of what bots do is that they trick other bots, like search engines, to elevate topics in news feeds and search engines and the like. But again, this is something that we need to confront when we start thinking about how the internet itself poses a challenge to democracy. Same is true, the same kind of shield that anonymity provides to machines, it also provides to human beings, right? So when you are able to engage in unaccountable speech, which is to say that where the person who's listening to you is not actually going to be able to send a signal to you about how they feel, right? You're more likely to engage in the kind of offensive speech or stuff that could be insulting or inciting. Third sort of phenomenon on the internet, and that is the dynamic of echo chambers and filter bubbles. We've got a fancy term for this in political science or communication studies, and that's homophily, right? It's the likelihood that you are going to self-select into an information ecosystem which sort of reinforces your beliefs. Now, on this point, there's actually quite a bit of debate among political scientists as to whether the internet is sort of leading to filter bubbles and echo chambers in our news consumption. Because to some extent, when you're on Facebook or when you're on another social media platform, you're exposed to the kind of people who might be different than the ones you walk into in your daily life, in your neighborhood. And so, if you're, of one particular political party and most of your friends in your neighborhood share that same partisan affiliation, when you get on Facebook, you all have that uncle, right, who's going to be posting, and you'd ordinarily just hear from him on Thanksgiving dinner, but now you get to see his screeds every day on Facebook, right? And so there is a debate about how much the internet is leading to homophily and echo chambers, but there's no question that in certain corners of the internet, right, certain corners of the internet like 4chan and 8chan, subreddits and the like, you have the capacity to self-select into information ecosystems that are privileging the kinds of beliefs that you already have. Fourth point is about sovereignty, right? And this, again, sort of the relationship to democracy is probably obvious. For the most part, throughout the history of democracy, we have assumed that there is a government that can control the electoral and campaign ecosystem, right? And so that the speech that would be relevant to campaigns will be mostly made by those who are inside the country itself. Right? Now, the Russian intervention in the 2016 election is only the sort of most notorious example, but you see this around the world with both state and non-state actors, the rise of even supranational consulting organizations that specialize in this. But if you go to Europe, they're actually worried about the sovereignty question from a different angle, right? It's not just about one country invading another sort of population's communication and campaign sphere. It's also about how American technology companies are essentially writing the rules for political debate around the world, right? And so Nick Clegg, who's the vice president of Facebook, former deputy prime minister of the UK, tells this story, that last March he had to go to Europe to announce what would be the rules for political advertising for the European elections, right? So just think about that for a second, that a vice president of an American technology company is going to the European community to announce what the rules are going to be for their elections, right? And this is, sort of an unprecedented chapter in the history of telecommunications. And that's related to the final problem or final phenomenon, which is the rise of the communication monopolies, particularly Google and Facebook. Now, Google and Facebook are unprecedented in the power and reach that they have over telecommunication sort of infrastructure around the world. The only historical analog might be the pre-Reformation Catholic Church, right? If you had to sort of search through, what has happened in the telecommunications realm for the last 500-600 years, right? Now, look, we obviously benefit a lot by having them here in our neighborhood. When I talked about myself as a practitioner, I do a lot of work with these firms. But one of the kind of key democracy endangering features here, which is different than the general kind of antitrust argument that you hear, is that the rules that Facebook and Google write as to their terms of service and community guidelines are in some ways more important than formal law when it comes to speech during election campaigns and with respect to democracy in general, right? And so those decisions over their terms of service, whether it's hate speech or incitement or political advertising, are really setting the ground rules for how democratic campaigns around the world are going to be conducted. All right, so I started this talk by asking the question, can democracy survive the internet? And I was tempted to sort of have a typical internet answer. The answer may surprise you. But the answer is that's what we at Stanford are trying to do. We've developed this new Cyber Policy Center, which is bringing together sort of a whole university approach from political science, from communication, from computer science, from law, from business, to try to attack these questions of how technology is affecting democracy around the world. In addition, we brought together people like Alex Stamos, the former CISO of Facebook, or Daphne Keller, formerly head of intermediary liability at Google, or Marietje Schaake, who's a former member of the Dutch member of the European Parliament, who's been big on tech regulation, to try to sort of bring Stanford to the forefront of thinking about these critical policy questions of how we can save democracy from the internet. Because we here in Silicon Valley may have broken it, but we're going to build it back up. So thank you very much.